Now we're going to try to get a better understanding of how the government basically regulated the hemp industry out of existence. To do that, we need to take a look at the history of medical marijuana and at the period in American history when alcohol was prohibited. We know that cannabis has been used as a safe and effective medicine for thousands of years. Over 4,000 years ago in China, cannabis was used to treat gout, rheumatism, malaria. But we need to learn more about who used it and how it was used. Recently, a 2,700-year-old mummified body was unearthed in the Gobi Desert. The body had been buried with 2 pounds of cannabis. What was the cannabis used for? Was it for spiritual, philosophical purposes, such as a shaman would use? Or was it for therapeutic uses as a medicine? These questions still need to be answered, but at least now we have a better starting point from which to begin our analysis. In the late 1700s, an American medical journal noted that hemp seed and the root of the cannabis plants were good for treating skin ailments. How else was hemp seed and the root used over the years by so many of the cultures that grew cannabis? We need people to document this and learn more about this. In the 1830s, William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish doctor practicing in India, documented how cannabis was being used to treat numerous ailments. Now this was in India. He's an Irish doctor practicing in India. He noted that they were using cannabis to treat a lot of different things, including muscle spasms, pain, and inflammation. It was also being used as a sedative and an anticonvulsant. So this was in the 1830s. O'Shaughnessy brought this information back to England, and it was wildly popular and successful. And by 1900, cannabis was being used in over 1,000 safe and effective medicines produced by companies such as Park Davis, Squibb, and Eli Lilly. Even Queen Victoria was prescribed cannabis for her royal ailments. These products were usually in tincture form or as extracts. Despite its versatility, the use of cannabis as a medicine declined in the early 1900s. Why was that? We need to document why that happened. It could have been because opiates and other newly developed drugs like aspirin were easier to produce. Or did it have something to do with controlling the potency of the cannabis medications? THC and the other 60 or so cannabinoids found in the cannabis flowers had not even been discovered yet. So creating standardized doses of cannabis medicines for specific ailments was very difficult indeed. I'm not sure why this happened, but the use of cannabis medicines steadily declined during the early 1900s. We need more help documenting why this happened. An interesting side note about this can be found in a short article in the 1917 USDA yearbook in an article titled Production of Drug Plant Crops in the United States. Regarding cannabis, it said, cannabis is now grown commercially as a sideline by a few farmers in South Carolina and by occasional individuals in some other states. 2 large drug manufacturers also grow sufficient cannabis for their own needs. Considerable technical skill is required to produce cannabis of a quality that will meet the standard requirements for this drug. Cannabis grown in some localities is deficient in the active principles upon which its value depends, and preliminary tests to determine the quality of the product are therefore always advisable before planting this crop on a commercial scale." End quote. The interesting part about this article is that the specter of reefer madness is not brought up. Rather, the author is objectively discussing the merits and drawbacks of growing cannabis as a drug or medicine. In 1913, California became the first state to prohibit marijuana, and by 1930, almost 30 states had passed some law against cannabis or marijuana. The purpose of the laws seemed to be social control and to discriminate against Mexicans and other racial minorities. Newspaper articles of the day earned their reputation for yellow journalism by loudly exclaiming the evil deeds done by people under the influence of the devil's lettuce. This would mark the beginning of the Reefer Madness era and the demonization of marijuana, which was a Spanish word for smokable cannabis. One such article from the Mexican Herald, published by the Boston Daily Globe on June 26, 1904, was ominously titled, "Dangerous Mexican Weed to Smoke." The article described how two Mexicans had smoked marijuana, began fighting each other, and had to be restrained with straitjackets. The article ended by saying, quote, "It is feared that the two men, if they recover from their wounds, will lose their minds permanently, as is often the case with marijuana smokers." End quote. A January 1919 article in the Boston Daily Globe discusses the legislation in Texas to prohibit the growing of the weed. It also implicates Mexican immigrants with the use of cannabis, as this quote shows. Quote, many crimes on the part of Mexicans of the lower class, both in their native country and Texas, are attributed directly to their crazed condition due to smoking marijuana. It is said to be the most powerful narcotic known, and it produces effects that are uncanny in their weirdness, both in the mind and acts of the victim of the weed. End quote. This article continues, in many cases, when the weed is smoked, it creates an abnormal, hilarious spirit, and the symptoms grow worse and more pronounced as the smoking continues. The eyes of the habitual smoker of marijuana have a wild, insane state. The mind becomes more stimulated, and into the system grows a spirit of provocative madness, which drives the victim to thoughts and deeds of cruelty and crime. Articles like this were routinely published in newspapers across the country. The unsuspecting public had no reason not to believe these articles, and in fact seemed to embrace their call to battle the demon's weed. During the early 1900s, because of the insignificance of the hemp industry, outlawing marijuana in many states barely raised an eyebrow. Anti-marijuana sentiment continued to build, and jazz musicians in New Orleans were subjected to persecution because they used marijuana to relax and for inspiration. The constitutional amendment outlawing alcohol in 1919 would play an important role in the eventual banishment of marijuana. Drunkenness and getting high were held in disdain by the religious zealots and women's groups that spearheaded the alcohol prohibition movement. The prohibition of alcohol proved disastrous in that it unleashed a huge black market with all the attendant violence, as well as counterfeit products like bathtub gin, which blinded and poisoned thousands. By the mid-1930s, police had declared war on marijuana. Gangsters who used to make money running bootleg liquor now had a new source of income. This was especially important to them considering that alcohol was no longer illegal. The lack of a national ban on marijuana had made state and federal authorities relatively powerless to stop the flow of this seemingly destructive narcotic. In October 1937, after the Marijuana Tax Act had passed, articles were still being published about the newest narcotic menace, the marijuana cigarette. This article gives a future nod to Harry Potter fans by calling marijuana muggles, and it also sort of downplays the negative effects of consuming this drug by calling it giggle smoke. In the 1930s, the government's Reefer Madness campaign, spearheaded by Harry Anslinger, rose to a fever pitch. newspapers were rife with stories of young men turning into insane murderers after smoking a single marijuana cigarette. And a movie called Reefer Madness was a big propaganda hit more recently, and there's a 2-minute trailer on YouTube that you may want to check out. By the time that the Marijuana Tax Act was being railroaded through Congress in 1937, nary a pro-hemp peep was heard, except from the makers of bird feed, who found that hemp seed made for a happy songbird. Makers of paint also favored hemp seed oil in their products, but the National Institute of Oilseed Producers was not a strong enough lobby to stop the bill. Even testimony against the bill by representatives of the American Medical Association could not derail this piece of railroaded legislation, which went into effect August 2, 1937. Much more research is needed to determine how fear-mongering could cow legislators into voting for a bill despite testimony against it from the hemp industry and from the American Medical Association. In 1942, the word cannabis was removed from the pharmacopoeia. Up until that time, doctors could still prescribe cannabis medicines. Cannabis should be returned to the pharmacopoeia, and perhaps you could help figure out a way to make that happen. The criminalization of hemp. Was it a conspiracy? I have no definitive proof that hemp was made illegal because of an industrial conspiracy. It seems to this researcher that the minimal number of acres of hemp being grown in the early 1900s prevented it from exerting any influence in the grand scheme of things. However, this is an excellent project for someone who is willing to perform some in-depth research to undertake. I look forward to the results of your investigation, and as always, you can send me your hemp research results for inclusion in the Cannabis Curriculum Clearinghouse. In 1938, Popular Mechanics published an article about hemp titled "The Billion-Dollar Crop." In it, they noted that hemp herds contain more than 77% cellulose, and that you can make more than 25,000 different products out of the herds, ranging from dynamite to cellophane. Chemists at the time were developing all sorts of new products, including plastics, based on cellulose. The article touted a decorticator that was being used in Texas, Minnesota, and Illinois. Factories were producing cigarette paper and bond paper. Around this time, Henry Ford was also researching the properties of cellulose-based materials, and in 1941, he produced a car that had molded fenders and other body parts made from plants, including hemp. Practically anything we make from a polluting, non-renewable hydrocarbon like oil or coal can be made from a relatively clean, renewable carbohydrate like hemp. Henry Ford used to preach this in the 1940s when he said, "Why use up the forests, which were centuries in the making, and the mines, which required ages to lay down, if we can get the equivalent of forests and mineral products in the annual growth of the fields?" End quote. Ford, who had a vision of growing automobiles from the soil, even produced a demonstration model with body parts partially made of hemp.